Hi, welcome back. It's hard to imagine that the world needs another Illustrator tutorial. There are so many good tutorials online already. What you want to do if you're really serious about learning Illustrator or any software app is go to LinkedIn Learning and make sure you use your UIC login. There you can have detailed tutorials about just about any software package imaginable. Also, if you're a commuter, get it on your phone. They've got a really robust mobile app, and even if you don't download and work along with the exercises, just watching the videos on your phone will do you a lot of good. The videos are short, they're easy to digest in small bites. They're very good, certainly better than any of my instructional videos that you'll find. And also very searchable. So if you're having a particular problem, say with text, say with color, it's easy to search and find videos that address just that issue. I recommend if you're a beginner or even an intermediate who never quite got the basics down, check out the essential training libraries. These are introductory, but very thorough and very good. They're my go-to videos when I'm looking to learn software myself. So give that a try. So what I'm going to do today, however, is run through a sort of quick and dirty um, tutorial with just the commands that you would need to put together a poster. We're going to treat the poster sort of like a bulletin board and just sort of tack things to it. We're not going to do a lot of drawing or a lot of Illustrator type visualization, but we're going to use it as a way of compiling our information. Presumably we have these assets, the work we've done. That's where most of the work is, and the individual assets, by the way. Putting together a poster is a very small percentage of the work. What's the point in putting a graphic or a pie chart even on a poster if you haven't spent the time to get that pie chart to look right? So that's where the actual time comes in. Putting a poster together, fairly straightforward. Getting each asset right, that's a little different. So our tutorial today, I'm going to go through just the commands necessary to put together a poster. Okay, so I've spun up Illustrator and I'm ready to start putting together my poster file. Um, a couple of things about Illustrator. If you haven't taken my class, there's a couple of things I'd recommend. One is that if you don't use shortcut keys, you're going to go a little bonkers. So I'm a big proponent of shortcut keys. Those are keys on the keyboard. And so what I suggest, and this is how I was taught, and it makes a lot of sense, right from the start, I'm going to introduce shortcut keys, and you should keep one hand on the mouse and the other hand on the keyboard. And if you do that right from the start, you'll work a lot faster in all the Adobe Creative Cloud applications. Most of the shortcut keys transfer between all the apps of Creative Cloud. So once you learn them, you'll have them down. So I can, this is the sort of intro screen. I can find what I'm looking for here, probably under more presets. But I'm going to introduce my first shortcut right off the bat. That's Control N. And you Mac users understand that when I say Control, what I mean for Mac is Command. And Control N brings up the new document. Very often the shortcut keys are Control and the first letter of the command. So Control N for new document. It's much quicker than going through the GUI, which changes all the time. The shortcut keys don't change. So I can find probably, I might find an architectural D size here too, but I'm a little pressed for time, so I'm just going to go ahead and type in my values here. I'm going to stay with a landscape page, 36 inches by 24 inches. And the reason I'm doing that is more because it's better for display purposes in this video. If you've got something you want to do landscape, by all means, you can do a landscape orientation. You can set it right here too, that's fine. But for the purposes of the video, landscape fits your screen better. You may be seeing some different values in this screen already. If you're using a lab computer, which you're probably not, but if you are, your units might default to something other than inches, maybe picas, which are 6 to an inch, I believe, or God forbid metric. So you want to keep your common units, and this doesn't change certain things like your font will still be in points that you understand to some extent. But this is going to give you the units you understand for things like page size and location on the page. So that's good to go. If I was going to do multiple artboards are the actual sort of pieces of paper that we're designing with. I could change that here. I could set multiple artboards, but I'm just going to do one because I know it's going to come out right. Bleed is something that's a little more advanced. We won't get into that. I'm going to leave these values. I'm going to accept the defaults on all of those, and I'm going to say create. And here is my, oh my desktop is a bit of a mess. What I'm going to do is, before I do anything, is clean up my desktop a little bit. On the pull down at the upper right hand corner, you have different workspaces. I recommend you work with Essentials Classic. Why do I recommend that? Because it's what I learned on and it's the one I know. If you want to give a try to Essentials or printing or layout, be my guest. All the same commands will be available. They might not be in the same place. So this is Essentials Classic that I had screwed up with some customization. So I'm going to reset Essentials Classic. And now it should look basically like what your layout looks like. So this white area, that is the artboard. That is 24 by 36. And that is what, that's the limits. I can put stuff outside of here, it won't print. Only the artboard prints. A couple of things, if you don't already know this, to zoom in or out, there's two ways of doing it. Control plus zooms in, Control minus zooms out, or hold down the Alt and use the scroll wheel. Alt scroll wheel is also a way to zoom in or out. To pan, hold down the spacebar and drag. So here's some more shortcut keys for you. Spacebar drag is to pan. Okay, the first thing we want to do is this will be our bulletin board. We're going to set up some layers. When you're working in any graphic program, it's all about layer control. Good layer control means you'll stay organized. These are the go-to tool palettes for the work we'll be doing today, as well as some of the tools here like the type tool. If you can't understand the hieroglyphics of the very subtle interface of the Creative Cloud, any tool that you're looking for is always available on the window pull down. You do, however, have to know the name of it. Layers is kind of a no-brainer. I can find that here. Also, that's one of the icons that sort of makes more sense. So here's the layers palette. And what I want to do is make enough layers right from the start to cover my poster. The lower right hand corner, this icon is for create new layer. Notice we have tooltips. If you hover over an icon, the tooltip will appear and tell you what's about to happen. So I'm just going to click, click, click and make a few new layers. And I'm going to rename these layers based on what I think is going to happen in this poster. One thing I know I'm going to need is some pictures. I'm going to double click on the layer name and rename this pictures. One thing I might have is some quantitative graphics. Just going to call another layer graphs. One thing I'm definitely going to have is some text. I'm going to call this layer just text. Sometimes I like to get more specific with the text. More layers are always better than fewer layers. Name them so they make sense to you and stay organized. So I'm gonna make this layer text titles. Just a way of keeping things straight. There's no reason to skimp on the layers. Also, I happen to know I'm gonna do some sort of guidelines, and I like to draw those in myself as opposed to using the ones that come in Illustrator. I find it more useful. So I'm going to double click on this one and call that guidelines. Now, if you happen to double click outside or not on the layer name, you get this dialog box. It brings up the layer options dialog. I could rename it here as well if I wanted to. You can change things about the layer. What I'm interested in changing now is the print. I don't want my guidelines to ever print. So I'm going to deselect that. And now anything I draw on this layer, guidelines, is not going to print. This color has nothing to do with the color of the entities I'm going to create. This is just the color of the Windows bounding box. If I select something, you get that Windows bounding box. It shows you it's selected. It's going to be on this layer, magenta. Right? So I'll say OK. Notice that guidelines, which does not print, is italicized. So that's a short way or a quick way of seeing what's on the layer, if it's going to print or not. On the layers that are going to print, we have them not italicized. Looks like I have an extra layer. It's not going to hurt anything, but I'm going to go ahead and just drag it to the delete the garbage can icon to delete that layer. Now I have only the layers that I need. So the first thing I'm going to do to confront this horrible blank page is to draw some guidelines in, similar to what I did on my hand-drawn comp. There are guidelines available within Illustrator itself also. One thing that some people like to use is the grid that comes with it. The grid you can toggle on or off on the view pull down. If it's off, your only option is to show the grid. And if the grid is on, and the grid doesn't print, of course, if the grid is on the view pull down, your option is to hide the grid. Notice also that you can snap to the grid. And that's a behavior that when you're trying to draw a line or place text, it will allow you to snap to points on the grid. Works okay. I've never been a big fan of it. And I'm actually not even sure why. But feel free to experiment with that. That might be just your thing. I'm going to hide the grid, and I'm going to make a custom grid. I'm going to make my guidelines layer current. And you can tell the current layer because it's highlighted in blue. And the first thing I'm going to do is just draw a rectangle using this rectangle tool on the left. If you're brand new to Illustrator, go ahead and draw a few rectangles, have some fun. It's very easy to draw. It's not a terribly steep learning curve in Illustrator. It's easy to just start producing a product. Anytime you're done with a command, you see my cursor has changed. It's still in the sort of draw rectangle mode. If you're not doing anything, you want your cursor to have this selection tool on it, this black arrowhead, or it looks a little bit like, used to be an old video game called Asteroids. It looks like the spaceship from the Asteroids. And it's the black one, not the white one. We'll get into that a little bit later. This is called the selection tool. I'm just going to pick off in space so nothing's selected. If you select something, it gets highlighted in the color of the layer. That's all that means. And now you recognize this, of course, from Windows. Now you know you can just drag it. You can, if you can get your cursor over the corner and get the double arrows, you can rotate it, and it's regular manipulation. Some of the shortcut keys you're familiar with also work here, like control to select all. A Control A will do that. I'm going to escape, or sorry, pick off in space to deselect that. You can add certain things to a selection set by holding down Shift. So Shift adds entities one at a time or removes them one at a time from a selection set. Shift adds elements one at a time, or Shift also removes elements one at a time. Selection set is important because that's what, when something's selected, any edit command that you do, like move, that's what it's going to act upon. Control Z, of course, is always undo. I'm going to do a Control A to select all and hit delete. I'm going to draw just one rectangle back. So a rectangle is a closed path, and it has three parts. I'm going to go get my selection tool. By the way, I'm going to need to do this so many times. I'm going to use the shortcut, which is just V, to get me back to my selection tool. Not Control V, which would be Windows paste, but just V. And when I select something in Illustrator, my context-sensitive menu, that's this menu ribbon at the top of the screen, changes. It gives me choices based on what I've selected. If I click off it, it's not selected. You see I get certain choices. When I select something, my choices change based on what it is I've selected. Two things that we'll be interested in here are the fill definition and the stroke definition of a closed path. And this is a rectangle, of course, but for us it's a closed path in Illustrator. Right now the default fill is white. I can hit that pull down and I can make it any color I want, of course. The default stroke is black. I'll make that just a dark blue, and right next to the stroke you see I have a width of stroke that's in points. I can make it as fat or as thin as I want. Notice that this fill and stroke definition also appears here. That's another way of reaching the same commands. In Illustrator, as in most software programs, there's typically many ways of doing a given task. I'm going to hit this and delete it just by using the delete button. And now notice that if I draw another rectangle, or if I hold down the flyout and try an ellipse, it remembers the last fill and stroke definition that I've selected. Well, what I'm envisioning is a grid that's very sort of subtle, that's going to allow me to lay things out on the page. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a rectangle again. And I'm not going to try and get it perfectly. Let's see, I want this to be no fill and cyan, which is a traditional no print color. And I'll make it thick so you guys can see it, but ordinarily this is a guideline is something rather thin. So I want this 1-inch margin that I thought about on my hand-drawn comp. Now, I could turn the grid on and snap to the grid, but what I've gotten the habit of doing is drawing it mathematically precisely by keying in the values. So if you look up, while it's selected in the upper right, these numerical values are telling me the dimensions and the location of this rectangle or whatever it is you've got selected. This weird little icon here, I don't know if it's got a name, reference point, that tells me what reference point these measurements are from. Length and width, height and width, that's the H and the W, that's not dependent on the reference point, but the X and Y values certainly are. So these X and Y values, just Cartesian coordinates, are based on the upper left-hand corner, and right now they're talking about the lower right-hand corner of this shape. So I can go ahead and select the upper left-hand corner. Notice my values changed. This tells me it's 1.4 and change X, that's to the right from the upper right-hand corner, and 1 point something something, I can't even see Y, that's down from the upper right-hand corner. I know what you're thinking, it should be negative values if it was a true Cartesian plane, but it's not. It's positive X and Y, it's an over and down. So I said I wanted it to be a 1-inch margin, so I'm going to go ahead and just back over that and type 1. You see it's moved my shape to that location, and a Y value also of 1. And now I'm going to deselect this lock icon. This constrains the width and height proportions. I don't care about that. I know what size I want to make this. I want this to be how wide? 36 inches minus 1, that's 34. And how tall? 24 inches minus 2, that's 22. So you see I selected that upper left-hand corner, so it held that corner and made it very easy to draw this perfectly in place. I have had situations where I think I'm snapping to the grid and it's not actually snapping to the grid. So this is the way to draw it perfectly. If I were to select another point at this time, I'll select the center on this reference point icon. It doesn't move anything, it just gives me the values of the center. And this I'd expect to be the center of the page, and it is. X of 18, Y of 12. That's the center of the rectangle, in as much as you can have a center of a rectangle. So with this, I'm going to use a little advanced trick here and make a grid out of it. And that is on the object pull down and path, and we're going to split into grid. And this is a neat tool for turning. It's actually would be somewhat time consuming to draw a grid, not to mention with, I'm not sure what kind of grid I want to draw. I just know I want some sort of a grid. So here it's going to let me adjust the number of rows and columns in real time until I find something that I like. If you ever have a palette that has the preview button, you're going to want to use that. So I can increase the number of rows and I can increase the number of columns, and I'm just going to eyeball a grid that looks about right. So this is subdividing based on not the size of the square, but based on the number of rows and the number of columns that I'm asking for. So we can see that the rows are actually 4.4 inches high, and I asked for 7, an odd number. So the width of these is 4.8571. They're almost square. A more typical thing to do in a grid for laying out a page is to add some gutter. And what a gutter is the space between columns and rows. And so I'm going to keep these the same size. This is the type of grid that I like to work with when I'm laying out a page. It's very much how magazines or newspapers used to and still lay out pages. And the grid may seem like it's constraining, but you don't have to just put stuff in the grid. It's a tool to help you stay organized on the page. So the only reason I like this grid is because they're almost square. That's what I like about it. I lost my gutter. No, why does it lose my gutter when I type in a different value? And I certainly like even numbers more than 5s and 7s. So I'm going to go with 6 and 8, and they're almost square, and that's a pretty nice looking grid, and I've got a reasonable gutter space. This is something I can work with to lay out a page. I'm going to say OK, and when I pick off it, you see what's happened is it's transformed that into many squares, many rectangles from the one rectangle. I'm going to select them all, and I'm going to kick the stroke down so it's thinner. That's about how we want the guidelines to be, nice and thin, just something to help me lay things out. Also, I don't ever want to accidentally do that. Control Z to undo. So right off the bat, I'm going to lock this layer. That's the second row here on the layer dialog box, so that if I'm working and I'm zoomed in tight and I don't even realize it, I know I can't do any damage by accidentally scooching it. I never want to move that guideline. It's not going to print. It's just to help me stay organized. By the way, one more shortcut key to zoom to the extents of your artboard, Control 0. So now I'm ready to start bringing in my assets. Remember I said it was kind of like a bulletin board. We could just sort of drag and drop stuff in here. I'm going to use the grid to maybe inform where I drag stuff. I want to make sure that my, let's say, pictures layer is current. Actually, I'll bring in my map first. Well, we'll call that a picture for now. And you can just drag and drop files into Illustrator, and it'll work out okay. Let's see how that works. Here's my map that I thought might be my featured item. If I just drag and drop it, it comes in, and notice it comes in at actual size, and that's never the right size you want it to be. But that's okay, because you can always just resize it using the bounding box. Make sure you hold down Shift, or you're going to end up with something like that. Control Z to undo. Anytime you resize something, hold down Shift so you maintain the aspect ratio. And these days you can change that to the default behavior. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I have seen Illustrator and Photoshop installations where it's the default to not even have to hold down Shift. So I can go ahead and notice how it snaps to my intersection. I can go ahead and start to use this grid a little bit to lay out my page. I'm not going to slavishly adhere to it, but I'm going to get pretty close. And of course, if I wanted to, you know how I can make it the exact width I want it to be. That's by selecting it and changing the values up here. But I'm just want to show you how you can just drag and drop stuff in. Let's bring in a couple of more photos. Here's a great one. Just dragging it from my Explorer, and seeing what I have to work with here, sort of. Did you guys know there used to be missiles at Montrose Harbor? It was a while ago. You could also use the file place command. That gets you to the same place. And let's see if I can find my files. And here it is. And let's see. Make sure I'm bringing in what I want to. And this is kind of useful to use this command. Drag and drop is nice, but this is actually perhaps more useful, because what this does is if you just pick a point, it does what drag and drop does. I'm going to Control Z to undo that and go to the file place command again. There's a nice difference, however, and that is that I can go ahead and pick a point and resize this right off the bat. Now it's holding that aspect ratio. And this is actually a more efficient way in some respects, because it sort of saves time. All right, so I got some images coming in. I'm not exactly happy with the weirdness, the way I'm using the grid. But just to keep going here, I'm going to bring in some graphs. I'm going to use the file place command. I'm liking that better than the drag and drop, but you certainly can use the drag and drop. But this has a nice efficiency to it. So let's bring in a graph. I thought I said I wanted graphs along the right column. Here's a couple of graphs. And so on. Now, if I wanted to leader these in, there's a couple of ways I can do it. One thing I actually might want to do is get a little bit of layering going. So I've got this sort of grid has sort of taken me this far. Maybe at this point I can break it a little bit. It's a nice image of Belmont Harbor with a Nike missile being moved in what looks like broad daylight. So here's a few things just dropped in, and it looks like we're coming up on the half-hour mark, so we're going to have to continue this. I'll see you in video part 3.